What's going on YouTube? How are you doing today? So today we're going to continue in the next video in our archetype theory crafting chain of videos. So today, from one of our YouTube comments, we had a suggestion or somebody asking if we could do Summoner next. So we're just going to dive in and we're going to theory craft all 8 archetypes for Summoner. So right at the beginning, you get a Summoner where it intersects with Bard. You get an Enchanter. Now, putting these two classes together, I think you're going to end up with a full support class. You know, they might be able to do some content on their own, but I think the harder solo content they may not be able to do without at least one other person. Now, how could the Enchanter work? So there's a lot of things to work through thought-wise when it comes to how an Enchanter would work, because at first you think, oh, they would just literally, quote-unquote, enchant things. However, you know, there's enchanting usually as a profession or just something that you do as a progression tool as a character. So you don't want to go too heavily into that because then they almost seem like they're just a profession class. And knowing that there are 8 archetypes down the Summoner line, you don't want to lean too heavily into, you know, it's hard to go too hard on like summoning things to enchant, because, you know, you don't want it to run into some of the other archetypes. You know, so how do we give Enchanter archetype identity so that it is unique enough for people to want to enjoy it and want to play it? However, it's not too crazy off the rails to where it's superior to everything else. And, you know, there's a lot to keep in mind, a lot of dials and knobs to twist and turn. So what I came up with, and I think the best version where I pulled most of my inspiration for Enchanter, was off a 5e D&D class called Enchanter. And then going through that, and, you know, I went through some EverQuest and had an Enchanter class, and a couple other games had Enchanter classes. And what I ended up with was an Enchanter, besides being a full support class, would summon, because we are trying to keep Summoner first, primary, would summon a rune or some kind of like crystal, or I think D&D called them sparks, and you can summon up to X amount of them. Let's say 5. 5 is a good number. And then by using those sparks, runes, crystals, whatever. Runes might make more sense. I like runes. Let's go with that. So you summon these runes. Let's imagine them as like rune stones that are like floating around you. Just something neat. Visually, they might not be able to actually let them do that. I don't know. And then by using these summoned resources, you then apply them to abilities. Let's say they're just your buffs, or you apply them to actual weapons or armor or other characters to apply buffs to them. And so imagine you have these runestones, and for 2 runestones you can, I don't know, add 10% attack for 20 seconds to a weapon. And, you know, then you can use that utility to then buff an ally or yourself if you're doing solo content. Then you can maybe, I'm trying to think out, sorry, the reason I keep pausing is because I'm trying to think of how they could use these in different ways on a skill bar or a toolbar. Because, you know, like in D&D, I could say like, oh, I have 5 runestones. Okay, well, I'm going to use 2 runestones when I cast this spell, and what that does is it adds a little more damage, or it makes the DC higher. But how do you translate that into a game that would work on the hotbar? So maybe there are buffs like, I want to say global, maybe? Like a buff where you're like, okay, if I spend 3 runestones, now all of my spells are quicker and do slightly more damage. Or all of my spells are quicker and they CC for slightly longer. Or things like that. So you're burning your runestones to buff yourself, but the primary, you know, the primary idea would be to use your runestones to buff your allies, or even debuff your opponents, right? So when I think of an Enchanter, it's really going to be a lot of crowd control, whether that just means stuns and slows and things like that, but as well as debuffs of some sort. And I think using the runestones or whatever as your resource, being something that you summon from another plane, or you just summon using your magic as a summoner, you know. And then if you're going to be a summoner to level 25, which is how this works, you know, you have to take your primary to 25, and then you get your secondary. Maybe taking a summoner to 25, you have basic summons, and you can actually use your runestones to empower your summons. Or maybe once you hit 25, your summons can become almost like conduits, or almost like little Tesla coils. And what I mean by that is, like, if I use 2 runestones to empower my tank, shield or armor or just my tank itself, then maybe that same spell can be forked out of wherever my summon is or my pet or whatever, and it can shoot it out too. So now my single target buff can now target 2 things. So that would be a cool way to incorporate your already summons from being a summoner, but then kind of overlay the Enchanter on top of it. You know, and this is another one of those classes that I think takes a very specific person to play, because a full support class who would not be able to delve or dive really deeply into solo content is probably not for everybody. And by that I mean is definitely not for anybody. Yeah, I've tried these full support classes, and it's weird because in a game like this, where PvP is going to be like huge, right? It's going to be all over the place. Having one of these guys in your back pocket, guys, gals, however, in your back pocket is going to make a huge difference. You know, if you're going 2v2 and they've got 2 DPS or a tank and a DPS, and you've got a tank or a DPS and an Enchanter, you're like, oh, well, you're you know, you're going to lose. Will you? You know, it depends on... These full support classes are made to be incredibly good at supporting. You know, you wouldn't... Maybe not in 2v2, that might have been a terrible situation, but like a 5v5 or a 4v4. Even a 3v3, you know, if you have 2 good guys and a really good strong supporter, those guys are going to be off the charts because of how strong you need to make an all-support class. So I think that with PvP being the center of a lot of things, I think being a full support class, you might be more fun earlier in the levels. However, most games where I've attempted this, it's really hard, like, if you're a full support class or you're, like, 90% of a healer. You know, I guess that would be technically full support, whatever. You have a hard time in the early game. You kind of get tired of, like, I have to try this content 3 and 4 times in a row before I beat it, you know, while other people are just, like, AFK grinding through the content because they're not a full support class. So I think it'll be hard to balance it in a way where where the first 25 levels of Summoner are enjoyable, but the next 10, 20 levels, once you are a Enchanter, it needs to be balanced to where it can do it. Maybe towards the end game where, like, I have to have another person, I would totally be down for that because it is a full support class. But that's going to turn a lot of people off. And personally, I don't know if I could do it. Now, I could see leveling as a summoner as one of the other archetypes, getting to the end game, and then deciding, you know what would be fun is if I go Enchanter now that I'm full level, I'm not worried about leveling as much. You know, I'm always PvPing in groups with a guild or my friends, or I'm at world bosses or dungeon content. You know, and now you're a big deal because you're already max level. You get what I'm saying? Maybe Enchanter is not as popular for leveling up, but once people hit max level, maybe Enchanter becomes much more popular as a full support class. But I'd love to know what you guys think about a full support class. So just what I'm saying is, like, Holy Priest in WoW, things like that, or Holy Paladin, like, they could do some content, but some certain solo content was really hard, you know, but as they got higher level and most of your progression came in group content, then they could shine more at supporting and healing and keeping people alive and getting through harder content, you know. And there are other versions of this in every game, but let me know, like, have you played a full support class, and if so, did you enjoy it? Why or why not? You know, pros and cons. Let me know in the comments below. All right, so next we're going to go into Necromancer. So this is going to be a difficult one, right? So Summoner meets Cleric is a Necromancer. The reason I think it's difficult is because a Necromancer throughout pretty much all of fantasy has had one aesthetic, right? It has had one design. You know, it is what it is. Almost every Necromancer that ever is created is evil, or has a tinge of evil, or a violent side. You know, even modern day, when you get into mangas and manhwas, you know, they're trying to make the main characters necromancers, for better or for worse, and most of the time they're like, they're a good guy, they just happen to use, you know, zombies and skeletons and shit, and people are like, oh my goodness, no, you're evil, and they're not. So they're, you know, it's what we're kind of in right now in genre of media, is like taking a primarily evil or bad trope and actually making it a good guy, good lady, whatever. So it's going to be hard for Intrepid Studios, the creators of Ashes of Creation, to tell me what a Necromancer is. You know, like with an Enchanter or a Wildblade or a SpellMancer, like they have a little more freedom to tell me what it is, to construct the identity of the archetype to me and inform me what that is and how it should play. But for a Necromancer, it's going to be a lot harder for them to take any real big liberties with it, due to the fact that we all have preconceived notions of what it could be, should be, and will be. You know what I mean? So that's going to make it really difficult. But right, I mean, let's go ahead and dive into it. So once you go Necromancer at level 25, we would assume, let's say you could summon a bear. Now maybe it's a zombie bear. You know, maybe it just adds like an undead modifier, which maybe gives it more attack but less health or less durability. Maybe you just get overall like resistance to poisons and death effects and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of ways they could do it. Pardon me. However, it's just harder, in my opinion. You know, how do you give them like a lot of really cool ideas without making them too strong? You know, the Necromancer, it almost makes me feel like they could do too much. Some of these classes that already have a huge identity, like the one right under it on the table, Paladin, you know, we have all these ideas of what they could be, and it could be really easy to run away with the design and just put in all these cool abilities and resources and things to really make the Necromancer feel like a Necromancer. But will that mean that the Necromancer is the best Summoner archetype just because there is so much more for them to build on, so much more to build around, and so they just got kind of carried away with it? Or they just wanted to make sure that this specific archetype they delivered on, you know, just like they want to deliver on a Paladin? Or things that we know what they are or what they should be, will they over-deliver on those specific archetypes and overshadow the identity of the rest of the archetypes? That's a worry I have for something like this. So we know that Necromancer is going to be summoning undead and have death and poison. You know, you could even look at abilities from Diablo 2, or even Diablo 3, the Necromancer that's in there, bone armors and weapons and summoning bone beasts and things like that. So I think I don't have to go too deep into it. A majority of what I wanted to talk about was the fact that I think it could easily overshadow other archetypes, and this one might be less of a how creative and intense can you get and give it identity, and more of a can you pump the brakes a little bit and make sure that it's really cool but not overly cool and take away the allure of the other archetypes. Alright, so the next one is Wild Blade. That's where we take Summoner and Fighter. Now this one was a little more difficult because most ideas I have of a Summoner is kind of a weaker ranged attacking mage who supplements their strength through summoning beasts or monsters to attack for them. Right? Sorry, hold on one second. That attacks for them. However, then you include a fighter who is, you know, it's a fucking fighter. They don't need nobody to do nothing. They just get up there and start swinging. So what I came up with was the idea, is because Wild was in the front of it. So that gave me a lot of thoughts real quick. So what I said was a Wild Blade could summon like animal spirits or beast spirits, things like that, to either fight for them or to inhabit their weapons and let them do other attacks. For instance, let's say the fighter has some sort of horizontal slash that's called horizontal slash. Can't think of a name. You know, it's called like Wild Slash. You know, that would go with Wild Chain. But you get what I'm saying? It's just like a big AoE horizontal slash. But if they summon the spirit of a bear, or whatever there's bears in Vera. So they summon the spirit of a bear, and now their damaging attacks do a bleed damage because of rip and tear. Or maybe it's a wider arc, so it's more AoE. You know, but they like summon the spirit of the bear, and maybe, I don't know how they could make the artwork or the visualization of it, but it happens, and now all of your attacks have like some sort of a buff. You could summon the spirit of an eagle or whatever, and then as you level up, maybe they get less like basic animal and they become more like cool enchanted beast. Now like the fury of the dire bear, or you know, if there's really cool animals with different names like the Kirin, like maybe it's the soul of the Kirin, spirit of the Kirin, you know, and you summon and possess, like you let a soul of a Kirin possess your legs, and now all your movement speeds are doubled and your movement effects are, you know, increased by X amount and things like that, you know. Or like you summon, you know, give me a big strong beast of some sort, and all of a sudden now my strength is up, my blah is up, my blah is up. So they turn into like a self-buffing spirit warrior, which sounds really cool, I guess. And the reason I keep using beast and not like monsters or magical monsters is because it says Wild Blade, so I'm thinking nature, thinking of wild. So I think that would be cool for the Summoner fighter to be a baseline fighter, because that's power really comes through all of the different spirits or animals that it can summon to inhabit its weapons and everything like that. Because we want to make sure that summoners first. So fighters bringing them to the front line and giving them the ability to do damage, really, right? But it's pretty much just a mediocre fighter. Until you import the summoner, which then just gives it all its power by summoning the beast, summoning the spirits, the souls, the what have you, to inhabit its armor, its blah blah blah, its weapons, its feet, its legs, its arms, you know, whatever. But that's how it gets its power. So I'm trying to make sure that I don't go too far into fighter, and I think just shifting the summoner from the back line to the front line and giving it maybe the option to do full damage with weapons, or maybe it opens its weapon pools, you know, suddenly that's enough. Okay, boom. Like, that's a lot, but that's enough. And then most of its power is coming from summoner, summoning those spirits and their souls. That way that our wild blade is still very summoner dependent and not all fighter with a little bit of magic. Basically, we want it to be more like a mage who can then use all of its, a summoner, I guess, better, is using all of its magical spirits and things that it summons to buff itself to then attack. That way, summoner is still primary. So I think wild blade could be interesting, especially if they were to go something even close to that route, because then it's kind of neat as you're going. You're like, oh, I am summoning these spirits, but I'm empowering myself. So, like, I'm up front, but now I'm doing really cool magical elemental damage in melee range. I like it. It could be interesting. Now, the difficulty there is, where does fighter intersect with... Fighter intersects with summoner. Blade caller. Yeah, and I've done this one before, not in one of these videos, but in a different video, where I said a blade caller could summon actual weapons to fight alongside them. And the weapons got all their stats from their stats, the abilities to fight. Yeah, I think they're different enough. What I worry about sometimes is when we're doing this, that we hone in on the summoner fighter thing and the intersection. We lean on summoner, and we get into it, and we come up with a good idea, but then when fighter's primary and summoner secondary, it's still the same idea, and you don't have archetype identity. So I got to make sure that whatever we come up with, there's enough archetype identity to not only differentiate itself in the primary class, but differentiate itself from its opposite, I guess. So, alright, mage. So, SpellMancer. So, this was a difficult one, because how do you make a summoner more magical? You know, they're already summoning beasts and spirits and souls, or whatever they're summoning. So what I thought of was, we know that mage is a secondary, gives you elemental options. Like, okay, now your abilities have electric. Now your abilities do fire. So, what if they just summoned elementals? But what if they were just like an elementalist? You know, what if they summoned your basic summoner pets, but with elementals? You know what I mean? Like, okay, I can summon a badger. Okay, now it's Pikachu. You know what I mean? I know Pikachu's a rat. I know. I fucking know. But, you know what I mean? So they have the summoner, and then they add the elementals to it, the elements to it, and now they're creating these elemental beasts, and that's what's fighting for them and casting magic. So assuming I summon a fire elemental or a summoner pet with the fire augment on it, you know, I can have them over here shooting little fireballs while I myself am shooting fireballs or what have you. Yeah, I think that was really it, because I was trying to think of how we could take advantage of both, especially because where mage intersects with summoner is a warlock. So those things are drastically different, so I don't think we have to worry about that. So yeah, I think leaning on like summoning elementals, almost like an elemental shaman, well, more like just a shaman from WoW, where they had a lot of elementals going on. Okay, so now that I say that, there's actually a shaman on here, which is cleric meets summoner. I feel like that one could be more witch doctor-y, but I like where we're at with SpellMancer. I really do think that summoning the summons and adding the elemental augments, or just summoning the elements as elementals to fight with you, I think that's a good way. They could probably flavor it a little different with it being a SpellMancer. Maybe they give life to their fireball. And now, instead of casting Fireball, you actually cast Living Fireball, you know, and it's a fire elemental. Or something like that. So SpellMancer seems like you're summoning and giving life to your spells, and giving this so that they can fight alongside of you. That might be a cool flavor option to go that route, but I do like that idea. So next, Beastmaster. And I think, honestly, guys, Summoner meets Ranger is Beastmaster. I think the easiest way to do this is probably simply a Beastmaster Hunter from WoW. right? So maybe the ranger now allows the summoner to use a bow. If they could use a bow before, maybe it allows them to do better damage with a bow or ranged weapons. And now they're summoning beast to fight for them. You know, now their summons do more damage. Maybe their summons now do a thing where when they do damage to the opponent, you get a bonus to your physical range damage, or you get a bonus to range damage. I don't know if they can do that or not, but that way it's kind of, okay, I'm a Beastmaster, so I want to play into the fact that I have all these beasts and they're attacking for me, but I'm also a Summoner Ranger, so I want to be back. How could I embrace the idea of the archetype and give life to the whole thing instead of you just sitting back, having your beast attack and just kind of chilling? Because that wouldn't be really fun gameplay. So what I think about is doing that and then having them apply some kind of debuff that would allow range damage to do more damage from your character specifically. You know, because now I want to like summon like hordes of beast, which is a little much, but it would be neat to like summon a snake, you know, or snakes, similar to a snake trap or whatever from Hearthstone, as the idea that I have in my head, and suddenly like 3 snakes pop out of the ground and they entangle the opponent, and the opponent is entangled or slowed or poisoned, all while you're attacking, and you summon a bear to attack, or a boar, or whatever. So I think Beastmaster could be interesting, and I think it and Wildblade would be are two that I'm kind of leaning more on, like nature-wise, kind of that Ranger Druid feel, where you're summoning nature's beast opposed to like magical or elementals or magical beast or anything like that. Okay, so Summoner intersect with Rogue, we get ShadowMancer. Now, right off the bat, I think about them like summoning shadows. Dark creatures made of shadow. What is it, the Heartless from Kingdom Hearts? Other games like that. Oh, man, there's one game stuck in my head right now from PlayStation 1. You were a kid with a colander on his head, and you're fighting all these shadows, and I cannot think what it was. Man, if you can think of it, put it down in the comments below. It was like a really good game. It was one of the first like long games. I think it was multiple disc. It was difficult. It was a good game. Anyway, so I think about summoning these shadows to really attack, obviously, but I'm thinking to like enhance your sneaking and your hiding. They can use them to flavor why a summoner suddenly could like pick locks and find hidden doors, is they call upon these shadow spirits to be like, hey, are there any doors around here? You know, and they go out and they find them and they let them know. Maybe like an Apex or a Capstone ability to summon a pet or a summon or a friend for X amount of seconds once they die to fight as a shadow. Things like that I think could be a cool way to use Summoner and Rogue together. You know, you're relying on all the shadows as a Summoner, but Rogue giving you more of that agility, maybe more backstab damage, kind of flavoring you to use the shadows to make yourself more hidden. And you get like, now your beast maybe can do stealth, or maybe their stealth have a higher dexterity, things like that. So that would be one way. You know, the thing I can't stop thinking about, which I'm sure some of you might, when I think ShadowMancer, when I think Summoner Rogue, more so than the Necromancer, I think about, to some extent, I think about solo leveling. I understand that he was a Necromancer. However, some of his abilities of like hiding monsters in people's shadows, using the shadows to move, using 2 daggers with like weakness and poison and things like that, you know, that feels ShadowMancer-y to me more than a Necromancer. Now, obviously, most of his kit was summoning the undead and having an undead army and all this stuff, so obviously a Necromancer. But some of the more moving through the shadows, hiding beast, or being able to hide in people's shadows, things like that, that seems more ShadowMancer-y, so that's kind of where I'm pulling some of these ideas from. Okay, Summoner and Summoner. Conjurer. This one was harder because it feels like we've gone over every iteration of what a Summoner could do already. So I'm thinking a Summoner, a Conjurer, besides the basics of just maybe all of their summons are stronger to an extent, maybe they get a larger summon pool, maybe they could do something like Pathfinder, where they have one summon, like they call it an Eidolon or an Eidolon, and they as they level up, their Eidolon levels up with them and gets stronger and better and better, and that's their primary method of attack. Maybe they could do something like that with a Conjurer. Like, a Conjurer can still summon for a short amount of time, or use summoner abilities, but maybe their whole thing is that they have like one big summon, one big thing that they conjure up, and they modify that as they level up. So now they're in the back kind of slinging basic spells, doing things like that, but they're summoned, they're conjured. Eidolon, Avatar, whatever you want it to be, is doing a lot of the damage. You know, that could be a cool way to set it apart. I don't know if they want to lean that heavily on just, you know, how would a class that primarily only has one pet? Because even in other pet-based classes, if they have one pet, they themselves can do a good amount of damage too. Like a hunter in WoW, like I have one pet, but I'm doing a ton of damage. My pet is too, and it's it's a large part of the damage that I do. However, you know, I still do a good amount of damage. I can't imagine a summoner. I'm thinking. I can't imagine a summoner would be able to pump out that much DPS as a conjurer. So making all their summons stronger and then having like one summon that sticks around the whole time. You know, even if like at max level it could be their mount. Yeah, that would be cool. If they could be their mount at max level, or as they level up, they can ride around on it. The Conjurer gets stronger and stronger, so their beast gets maybe stronger and stronger, slightly bigger. I like that. I kind of like leaning on having an Eidolon and Avatar, something like that. So the Conjurer still has your summoner abilities, and they still level up as a summoner. They have some skills for short summons, for just attack damage, buffs, things like that. But as a Conjurer, they have like one big baddie that they keep around, and that's what attacks primarily for them. And maybe they can buff it, buff themselves, buff allies, and it. Maybe it, when they buff it, it buffs people around it. That would be a really cool idea, and it would be different than everything else. I like it. All right, Broodwarden. As always, most of these classes, when they intersect with tank, are the bane of my existence, because I just can't figure out how to make them a tank. No matter how much I research, no matter how much I look stuff up, I just have an issue with it. So Brood usually is like a smaller group, or just a group of animals. You know, I think of a group of small animals, squirrels, chipmunks, bugs. You know, and how would they use that as a tank? You know, I had ideas of them maybe, I don't know if they flavor or give them abilities to taunt, gain aggro, hold aggro by aggravating them with a group of squirrels attacking their face. I mean, but if you used insects, like I got hyper focused on insects. I don't know why. When I think Brood, I think insects. You know, and then I started thinking like that would be a really cool tank idea, because then you could have them like summon swarms of mosquitoes, right? And the magically empowered mosquitoes drain opponents and heal you an extent of it. That survivability makes me think tank. Using just various swarms of insects to debuff and buff yourself, or add durability to yourself. You know, if you were to cover yourself in a swarm of beetles that have hard shells, maybe your defense goes up, quote unquote. You know, things like that. Or you summon like shell of the Hercules beetle or something, and your strength goes up and your endurance goes up. But then I was like, well, if you lean that hard into insects, why couldn't they call it like a Knight of the Swarm, or a Swarm Knight, or something like that, to really lean into it? So then I was like, okay, well, what if they don't do that? What if they summon, you know, what if Brood is like a swarm or a pack or a herd of animals? I was like, oof. Okay, well then they'd be summoning like spirits of animals like the Wild Blade, where they're like, okay, well, maybe their ability is like an AoE turtle shell. Or maybe they let out a bellowing roar that's called like Roar of the Lion or Roar of the Bear, and that generates a ton of aggro. You know, but I don't know, Broodwarden doesn't really scream to me like summoning nature's spirits, and I'm just stuck on insects. I am. I don't know why. It doesn't say swarm, it says brood, and I understand that a brood doesn't have to be insects, but that's like all I can think about. So when I think of a Broodwarden, I'm really thinking of like an insect-powered tank with swarms of insects to take hits, soak up damage, lifesteal, add endurance, distract, CC. Things that you want your tank to be able to do. You know, do you go the invasion style? I think a Broodwarden could be more of your crowd control tank, because that's one of the 3 options they say. There's your basic tank, there's a crowd control tank, and there's an evasion tank. And I think he could be a crowd control tank, especially if we go that insect route that I've got completely stuck in my head. Using the bugs to, like, you know, if you're covered in a swarm of bees, you take a little bit of damage, but you're too busy going, I'm covered in bees, to attack, so you're CC. You know what I mean? Or summoning like a hill of ants out from under somebody and it distracts them, or the ants dig holes underneath of them and they suddenly drop down and they're slowed or they're stunned or what have you. So maybe Broodwarden using the insects and then being more of a crowd control tank. They would have durability, they would have lifesteal, similar to like the blood maggots and stuff that a blood DK has in WoW, and many various other life-stealing Dark Knight type archetypes and classes from various games. So I think that's where I'm at on a Broodwarden, is like a CC tank that uses bugs, that summons bugs and insects. I don't know. It just seems neat. It seems like something else a summoner could do, and it doesn't really play into any of the other niches we kind of created in these archetypes. So yeah, I think we're going to ride with it. I think that's what we're going to do. Now, I will say something cool with the summoner that they could do is allow you to modify your summons. You know, let's say they summon, I don't know, a bear. Say a bear is summoned by all archetypes because they all have to be summoned on level 25. Maybe all of their basic summons that every summoner archetype has, maybe it slightly changes with your archetype. You know, like if it's a Broodwarden, maybe now the bear looks like has beetle shells on it. You know, or insect carapace, so that's sturdier. And a ShadowMancer, maybe they have a bear, and instead of a bear, it's like a slimmer, sleeker shadow bear. Beast. You know, if it's a Beastmaster, maybe it's just a bigger bear, or more feral bear. If it's a Necromancer, undead zombie bear. SpellMancer, elemental bear. You know what I mean? So I feel like they could play with the summoner. Now, I think that it'd be fun too, like, as a summoner, you could go on summoner-specific quests and things to get just skins, vanity things for your summons. Effects for your summons. Maybe not effects, because then when you're trying to render a bunch of, like, 100 versus 100 or 50 versus 50, maybe that's an issue. But you would have summoner-specific quest lines to just unlock cool skins, cool effects, cool things, augments for your summons. So they had slightly different views or colorations or things like that. Just another something I think they could do with the summoner that would be fun. So guys, that is the summoner. We went through all of them. I think out of all of them, I liked where the Broodwarden ended up. I just like the idea of a tank using bugs, and I like the idea where we came up with the Eidolon for the summoner and summoner, the Conjurer. Beastmaster seems a little vanilla, I know, but I mean, it kind of says itself, you know. Necromancer, I think that might be one of the tougher ones, just because of the difficulty of balancing what they want it to be and what we all think it already is. I think that's going to be difficult for them. Wildblade could be fun. Might need a little more work just from a theorycraft standpoint. Enchanter I actually enjoyed. I don't know why. There's always one archetype in all these classes that I come up with that has like another resource pool. You know, in Rogue we came up with a couple. In Ranger we came up with a couple that had a resource pool. Like Soulbow, we said you had to build up to life arrows or death arrows. And in Enchanter, kind of feels like you have to build up your runestones and then use your runestones to do some cool enchanting stuff. I think that's kind of neat. It'd be a different gameplay for a summoner. You know, some of these other ones are just summon things and let them go do things, and you do minimal damage from the back. But Enchanter feels like you are summoning resource to then use to play your class, which is kind of neat. Wildblade's the same way, slightly different. SpellMancer, kind of, to me, it doesn't seem as unique as it could be. You know, giving your spells life seems like a really cool idea, but when that kind of ends up just being elementals and elemental-inspired summons, maybe it's not as cool and unique as I thought it would. But then again, we've got 64 archetypes. How cool and unique can they make each one? So I think all of these are pretty good. I think my least favorite, probably the ShadowMancer. I just couldn't come up with anything really outside of what I did. Like, I feel like I could have came up with more. I think out of all of them, I think ShadowMancer and SpellMancer might have been the weakest. I like a lot of the other ones. I think my favorites being probably Broodwarden and Enchanter. So yeah, thanks for sticking around. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I can't wait to jump into the next class, which if I haven't decided by the time I make the next video, then we will make it a... I am having issues here. We'll just pick. But if one of you guys want to come down in the YouTube comments and tell me what you want, or hey, why don't you do Bard next, or why don't you do Mage next, or what have you, then we'll go from there. Thanks for sticking around.